Hey guys, Zane here with another One Take review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Björk album, Fossora. Fosura is the latest studio album from multi-genre experimentalist and pop musician Björk, and if you aren't familiar with the name Björk, then you most likely haven't been keeping an eye on pop music over the course of the last, say, 30 years, give or take, as she truly is one of the most consistently bright and burning stars within not only pop music or electronic music, but just music in general, really, and her impact on both of those genres in the modern day is undeniable and has since really just placed her in the hallowed halls of critical acclaim and even public acclaim. And we are now at a point in time where Björk is even considered a mainstream recognized individual. I mean, just go on Twitter and see what kind of love and hate, but mainly love, that she ends up getting. It does just genuinely feel like every Björk album release feels like a special event or holiday within the music geek community, a day that people await after it's announced so they can pick apart the record and determine whether they love it or hate it, much more so than the vast majority of other artists, even artists that are just as legendary as Björk, artists that were around at the same time doing similar things. She truly is a force to be reckoned with even in the modern day, and as such it's understandable that so many people hype up a new album from her every time it gets into talks and discussions, and Fossora is no exception. However, unfortunately, despite it being a strong release, her latest studio album, if you were to rank all of her albums from best to worst, would probably fall somewhere in the bottom half here. Never one to fall behind the times, Fossora is another self-reinvention of Björk's sound. She has never been one to just stick to one particular sound. In fact, you'd be hard-pressed to find two different projects from her that sound even remotely similar. The last time that could really be said was maybe her 90s output, and since then she's just been constantly trying new things, dipping her fingers and toes, or sometimes just taking a full swan dive into new sounds, and Fossora is more of an adaptation and continuation of what she first introduced on her last full-length studio album, 2017's Utopia, which brought up a lot of influences that were based around glitch pop and some more deconstructed pop sounds, but those influences are just completely ramped up here. Taking notes from composition-reliant art pop-based artists like Serpent with Feet, someone that Björk actually collaborates with here on the track Fungal City, as well as minimalism and deconstruction-based pop and electronic acts like the late great Sophie, Björk really does allow her sound to evolve a lot more here than it has in some time, and that's really saying something considering she is quite literally a chameleon of pop and electronic sounds, and this avant-garde nature is polarizing throughout the entirety of the album in terms of success, despite the fact that it is always interesting. Hey, no matter what you actually end up thinking of the album in terms of quality or how much you personally enjoy it, there's no denying that this is just another example of how creatively striking Björk is capable of being. She really is a absolute powerhouse of creative thinking and the creative process in avant-garde and experimental pop music, and this is no exception. That being said, despite the fact that Fossora does definitely have a pretty standard level of quality and manages to stay above the bar that it sets for itself with the individual that's behind it at least, there are a couple flops in the track list here. I mean, tracks that are just frankly unmemorable, like Freefall, and some of the instrumental passages that don't really add much to the record or the songs they belong to do ultimately feel like potholes in the road to success. Now, that's not to say these aforementioned songs are bad. In fact, in the grand scheme of things, they're actually quite decent. It's just that they ultimately feel like they have no place on Fossora overall, as they don't really add anything to the overarching themes of the album relating to the survival of life and the continuous existence of life, and really just connecting with life itself. There's a lot of life themes here, and as you may have based on the album cover or interviews that you had read or listened to with Björk herself, this is a record based around mushrooms specifically, aesthetically, so it really does all connect to this very Earth-like theme, and it's captured well here for the most part, but there's just enough dead weight here for me to say that there are a couple things that could have been cut off. I will say that for what Fossora often lacks in terms of not having dead weight at times, or sometimes just dragging on a bit too much for its own good, it absolutely makes up for in the utter tenderness in Björk's voice, which is honestly somewhat rare, as some of her weaker works have been noticeably emotionally isolated and cold with no real impact in that regard, while some of her stronger works have perfectly managed to balance her avant-garde musical and compositional tendencies with a more honest, emotional, and raw vocal performance from Björk. I'm talking albums like Debut and Post. While you could definitely argue that Fosora is still in the former category, being a bit too isolated for its own good in terms of actual conceptualism, I really do firmly believe that some of Bjork's most honest and overall just great and emotional performances are found on this record in terms of actual vocal work, and that's not really any sort of coincidence, as there is some admittedly very sad context behind that. Björk's mother, for those who aren't aware, passed away in 2018, a year after her last studio album came out, and this very obviously ultimately impacted Björk's creative process in the making of Fossora, and with two of the album's highlights, Sorrowful Soil and Ancestress, being written directly about her mother, there is a lot of her ghost being sort of haunting this album, if that is appropriate to say, I suppose. And overall, I just really mean to say that I think a lot of the tragedy that went on to Björk's life really managed to just, unfortunately or not unfortunately, ultimately translate into the actual work that she provides here. It really is the ultimate example of something that you almost kind of feel bad for enjoying as much as you do, because it does come from a deep and dark place for the artist that is behind it, but it really does ultimately result in something that is quite moving, and I can't help but enjoy it more because of this, simply because it's so obvious that Björk went through so much pain and is really just letting that out emotionally through her work on Fosora. Again, the album is just better for it. So overall, despite its habit of dragging on a bit too long, Fosora is another distinct and unique release from a legend that's in her own field, her own league entirely. I'm going to give Fosora 3.5 stars out of 5. My one take on this record is that although some mindless experiments may hold back Fosora from being a truly great record overall, a genuine sense of tenderness and some expectedly unique takes on the creative process from Björk ensure that this is another album of hers that's well worth getting your hands on. So again, 3.5 stars out of 5, and with that being said, that's the end of this review, and I will see you guys in the next one.